medicine. Dr. Celine Gounder is an epidemiologist currently serving as a CBS News medical contributor, is a senior fellow and the editor-at-large for public health at KFF and KFF Health News, and is a clinical associate professor of medicine and infectious diseases at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Dr. Susan Liebman is a geneticist, distinguished professor emerita at the University of Illinois at Chicago, research professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, and author of The Dressmaker's Mirror, a story of an Ashkenazi Jewish family, genetic risk, and research. Dr. Robert Marion, and finally, Dr. Yingying Tang. She is a medical geneticist and the director of the Molecular Genetic Laboratory at the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. And Dr. Tang is going to kind of lead us off with telling us a little bit more about her NIJ-funded projects and a little bit more about how we assembled our panel of experts. So with that, I'll take it to Dr. Tang.
Families, communities, and the criminal justice system. We provide answer for those affected by sudden tragic loss and help protect public health. Our molecular genetic laboratory is College of American Pathologists accredited and is the first and only such laboratory based in medical examiner's office. Dr. Gounder and Dr. Lieberman to talk about share their family experience and insight with us.
Well, thank you so much for having us, inviting us for the panel today. It's really an honor to be able to speak with all of you and to share what me and my family have gone through over the past year. I'll just briefly describe the initial news that I found out that my husband had died. And we didn't really know very much at that time as to what might have happened. First thing that crossed my mind was a pulmonary embolism because he had taken this long flight to Qatar, maybe something like that. Know that the medical examiner in New York City was the only one in the country to do molecular testing as part of the autopsy. That was just not something I knew. But as somebody who's also on faculty at NYU, who attends on the wards at Bellevue, this also felt like a very safe place for me to have this done. It was people who were essentially my colleagues doing this, who are among the best in the world. And I really needed for this process to be unimpeachable to put these kinds of rumors to rest. An autopsy in Qatar would just simply not have done that. And so with everyone's help, we got my husband back, I think it was a Tuesday morning. We went to meet him, his body at JFK, followed it back to the medical examiner's office. And I think within a day or so, we had preliminary results that this was, his death was due to a ruptured aortic aneurysm. And my husband had been an extremely healthy person prior to this, had never had any medical issues, was somebody who worked out 2 to 3 times a week with a trainer doing weightlifting, who used to be, was still a runner, but had gotten more into rowing in more recent years. So extremely, extremely fit person, didn't smoke, didn't use drugs. And so I knew it was going to be something out of the ordinary that causes sudden death among young people. I mentioned pulmonary embolism, aortic dissection or rupture is, also top of that list. So on some level, it wasn't shocking, but on some level it still was, that this would be the thing. And what proceeded from there was Dr. Yingying Tang, facilitating the genetic testing, which did show a mutation in the fibrillin-1 gene. He did not have Marfan's per se, but it's the same gene as I'm sure you all know, that's implicated in Marfan's. And Grant did not meet criteria for Marfan's, where his primary care provider thought it was indicated to test him. And that said, because he didn't have the Marfan's mutation per se, it probably wouldn't have made a difference here anyway. What he had was a previously unknown variant that we are still not entirely sure how that might have contributed to his cause of death. Since then, we have also gotten other family members tested, some of whom are carriers for the same variant. Number of them have also gotten both echocardiograms as well as CT aortograms to assess for aortic aneurysm. And we are working with Diana Milowitz at the University UT Houston in Texas, in Houston, to further characterize this variant, this mutation.
When I heard that Dr. Gounder would be on with me, I noted that we shared an experience many years ago, both attending the 1996 Princeton graduation. You know, people don't think that sudden death is going to hit them. This is something to hit somebody else. And hovering over Princeton graduation in 1996, there was sudden death. On the left, you see my sister who was with us, and she was 54. And on the right, her daughter, my niece Karen, who was at that time 23. 4 years later, my sister came down with a cough, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. They told her it was the flu, or it was bronchitis, it was pneumonia. Finally, her daughter-in-law, who was a family doctor, came for a visit and said, "You know, Mom, I think it's your heart." She went to see a cardiologist. She was in heart failure. He said, "It's never getting better. You don't have any family history. You don't have any diseases, you know, drugs, anything that could have caused it. It was caused by a virus." The first I heard of long COVID. And in any event, her daughter, Karen, went on to have adventures. And by the time she was 36, she met the love of her life, actually re-met. He was a high school friend, Andrew, that she knew when she was in high school. And since she was 36 and he 37, well, he was also 36, and they were worried about children. And lo and behold, right away, she got pregnant. And on the right, you can see, actually on the day of her death, Karen with her husband showing off her bump. That day, they went out to eat at a Colombian restaurant in downtown Brooklyn. And as Andrew recalls, she lurched upward, eyes wide, and then slid down. The EMT was there within minutes, but they were unable to restart her heart. An emergency cesarean section. Her son lived for a minute or two, but he could not sustain life. This was 28 days to the day, 28 years to the day after my father died suddenly of a heart attack. When my father died, I was with him. It was not sudden like Karen's. It was within an hour he died. The emergency doctor told my mother and me that this was a coroner's case. But my mother said, "Oh, no, 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 we're Jewish. You know, don't defile the body." And he said, "Okay, fine." I'm afraid, you know, it still haunts me that had we allowed that autopsy, we might have gotten information that could have made an earlier diagnosis for my sister, who almost died of heart failure, and could have possibly saved my niece, Karen. Karen was brought to the New York City coroner's office, and Barbara Sampson was the pathologist who examined her and was unable to find the cause of death, but removed her heart and sent it for further study. And oh, by the way, yeah, I did mention about the virus. We got the report about a week later, and it sent shockwaves through the family. She had died of dilated cardiomyopathy, what they called idiopathic. There was no reason, but of course there was a reason. My sister had dilated cardiomyopathy, and it wasn't caused by a virus. It was caused by a mutation. So I, as a geneticist, I set forth to try to find the mutation. My sister underwent various testing. She didn't have any of the known cardiomyopathy mutations. I heard of Dr. Elizabeth McNally because her husband was a yeast geneticist and was in the community of yeast geneticists that I belonged to. So I became Dr. McNally's patient, and she really took care of my sister. She kept sending her DNA out for additional testing. And finally, the cost of full exomic testing was reduced to about $50,000. And Dr. McNally said, I've got, 5 patients here. I can't figure out what they are. I'm going to use my grant money and sequence their exomes, which she did. I moved to Reno about that time, and we weren't talking all that often. And she published a paper in 2014 hypothesizing that a splice site mutation in the FLNC gene caused patient named, which was my sister. But she didn't tell me because she wasn't sure that that was the cause. When my sister died 2 years later, I contacted her and said, my sister's dead. What's happened? And she said, oh, we've got this FLNC mutation. A lot's happened since I published it. And so she told me what it was, and that I needed to get clinical testing, which I did. And then she wrote a Dear Family letter, and I started contacting family members. Of course, the first two people to contact were my children. And I should backtrack a little. Before we knew the mutation, we were told to get echocardiograms every year. And my husband was not happy about this. He didn't want me to tell the children. He's afraid, they're of childbearing years. They're going to be afraid to have kids. So we compromised, and I was allowed to tell them, but only once. I wasn't allowed to, the compromise was that I wasn't going to remind them every 6 months or every year and say, did you do this? And they, my daughter continued to do this. Apparently my son was told by his doctor that since I wasn't sick, he couldn't get sick, so he forgot about it and never did it again. Apparently there are physicians who don't know about penetrance. So after we found the mutation, I told my kids, you're done. My daughter was thrilled. My son didn't know he was supposed to be doing anything. Then I set out to find other family members. Those who knew me were happy to take advantage of Dr. McNally's offer to help them do genetic testing. Those who never heard of me were very suspicious. What did I want from them? I did find 2 family members that I am suspicious, but I'm not sure they ever got tested. One my uncle had told me about, but he told me this was a fluke. It couldn't possibly be related. It was a man of 32 years old when he died. He was my father's cousin, and he left behind two young children aged 2 and 4 who were now in their 30s, but they really didn't want to hear from me. And he had died snorkeling on vacation in the Bahamas those many years ago. The other was a young man in his early 40s who had heart arrhythmia, whose doctor said, well, you're just nervous. And he said he was going to check up on it. And we had a nice correspondence, but I'm not convinced he ever did. So it's not easy to get people to act, even when we finally have something to act on. I did want to mention the last relative. Well, so my father's mother died in her sleep, also said to be heart attack. So, there was family history. We just didn't know it. We had no idea. And then there was another family history. My father had an older brother who was 4 when he died. My father was 2. And my grandmother was a dressmaker, and she had a huge mirror. And the story was, for over 100 years, that the dressmaker's mirror fell on the 4-year-old and killed him instantly. And so this was the story we all knew. But as I was writing this book on the family with the goal of promoting genetic testing, I decided to get the death certificate and see, how did he die? How did this kill him? And there was no mention of any accident or injury of any sort. The boy died of heart failure after a 5-day stay in the hospital. So my grandparents had manufactured this story to hide what they already knew. Before James Watson was born, before he discovered DNA, my grandparents had figured out that our fate was in our genes. They didn't want prospective marriage partners to figure out that their boys might have a bad fate, And so they lied, they moved, and they changed the story. But now, with your help and the amazing things that I saw from the recorded talks, we can actually change our fate. And thank you so much for all of the work that all of you are doing to save people's lives, people who don't know, who aren't yet frightened. So a sudden death, you asked what it does to the family. First, it gives this terrible grief, and then it gives this terrible fear. And you can help prevent it happening and alleviate, in my case, the fear. It was wonderful. The fear went away. My nephew did not want to get tested. His wife, the physician, felt that an echocardiogram was all they could do, and that was enough. But then there was another paper that came out that said that you also needed, that you could have a perfect echocardiogram and still drop dead. You also needed an MRI, and you also needed Holter monitor. And by then they decided to go through and get the testing. And we were blessed in that regard that both my nephew and I do not have the mutation. And so our families were totally relieved of this terrible fear. I guess that's most of the story. Thank you for listening.
Excellent.
And thank you for your work.
Thank you both to Susan and Celine for sharing your story and really putting into context the kind of information and answers that this type of testing can provide to families, as well as highlighting some of the complications surrounding gathering family histories and how difficult it can be to kind of have those conversations. So thank you for that. We look forward to your perspectives kind of moving into our discussion portion of our event. So to get things started, I was wondering if Dr. Gill and Dr. Paneri, as former presidents of the National Association of Medical Examiners, can you just maybe give us a little level setting of the general state of postmortem molecular testing within the medical legal field? And then we'll kind of open it to the panel to see maybe where it's going to go in the future.
Sure. You want me to start? Or?
Yes, go right ahead.
So, the introduction of new techniques and technology into forensic medicine always lags behind its introduction into clinical medicine. So we all, I think, are well aware that DNA testing in forensics is not just for identifications anymore, although the FIG and the genetic genealogy is opening up many doors for identification. This symposium is on molecular autopsy, and I'd be derelict not to mention the important role that molecular testing plays in infectious disease as well, COVID-19, myocarditis, et cetera. I would say that most offices around the country have been collecting blood cards, for decades. In Connecticut, we've actually, for the past few years, also been collecting purple top tubes on every autopsy as well. And as far as name accreditation, they require name accredited offices to maintain DNA samples indefinitely. But really, that's the only requirement they have at the moment. And I think I was looking through some of the autopsy standards in Maine, and they require offices to have access to forensic anthropologists and so forth, but they don't require offices to have access to a molecular lab. And I think that's something that we probably need to add to our standards. We don't have a good handle on the number of offices that use molecular testing, and I think that's a survey would be very welcome in this area. I know Kelly Keys, I dropped a little seed to her. She's with RTI, and she participates in the survey, this national survey of medical examiner and coroner offices they do every few years. And I suggested to her to add that option, that question to it. Cost has always been a limiting factor, I think, for a lot of offices. In the past, it used to cost thousands of dollars to do molecular testing. Now some of the commercial labs, at one point they were doing it for free. One lab was doing it for free for us. Now it costs us about $300 to do a full kind of cardiac panel, which I think if you look at the cost for offices to do some toxicology testing or even microbiology testing, that is well in the range of I think, of budgets. The last thing I would say is the types of cases. And I think when we have a negative autopsy, it's much easier to get some buy-in for testing when it's a young person, it's unexpected death, as opposed to a case where there's a clear kind of class 1 finding. When you see an aortic dissection or a pulmonary thromboembolism, some medical examiners might say, oh, I've got my cause of death, but they really forget about the proximate cause. What caused that, the aortic dissection? And that's what we really need to look at. And I remember in 2019 in Kansas City, Kathy Paneri gave a talk on hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and the role of molecular testing. So I'll pass the baton to Kathy to talk about her view of this.
Awesome, thanks, Jim. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of postmortem genetic testing. I see it as furthering our role as medical examiners and coroners in the field of public health, because we have a responsibility to help prevent death if we can. And my experience with the postmortem genetic testing has been invaluable. I have found thrombophilias that run in families. One of them started with a 15-year-old girl that died from cerebral venous thrombus. And then it tracked down into other siblings and other aunts and uncles, and very valuable information, because one of them was about to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine during the COVID time, and that would be contraindicated in someone with a pre-existing clotting problem. So I actually just finished a case of a 21-year-old who just died suddenly while driving. Unfortunately, has some trauma and lived for a little bit, but he has a genetic mutation for Becker muscular dystrophy. And there was another young male that had died in that family. And then we tracked it back to the mother's side of the family, and then her aunt was tested and had it. So it's such an incredible value. I would rather spend the $300 on this type of testing for the families than $400 for a toxicology panel for a lot of these cases, because it just provides so much information. And while there's comfort in being negative, as Susan was, there also can be reassurance in those that are found to be positive, because there's interventions that they can undertake. And it used to be that when we found hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we would just tell the families, yeah, you might want to get checked out. And that was really all we could offer. But now we can offer this testing for the decedent and then for the families. And there are interventions. They can get defibrillators, they can get monitoring, they can measure aortic aneurysm size until graft placement is needed. So I am a huge fan. We probably order genetic testing. It's not in every single case, obviously, but very low threshold. Probably 20% of our natural deaths we do genetic testing on now.
Excellent. Thank you both for sharing that. And does anyone else have any kind of more comments to add? No? Okay, excellent. And as you had mentioned, with the kind of cost of those testing going down, this is becoming a much more kind of common practice, or perhaps a practice that more medical examiners' offices are kind of looking into. So Dr. Graham, I didn't know if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more. We had mentioned the blood cards, but maybe elaborate a little bit more onto how to implement, or perhaps how to improve their sampling and testing procedures within their offices.
Sure, thank you, and good afternoon to everybody now, or for some of us it's afternoon. I just, to sort of carry on with a bit of the conversation that we just had, I feel like that this is, as Dr. Paneri said, is very active, life-saving work. And it's, you know, for medical examiners, often the life-saving nature of our work is sort of a game of delayed gratification, either at the end of a lengthy, you know, criminal justice process, or getting a dangerous product off the market, or, you know, the day-to-day gratification of you know, telling families what happened. But this is active, life-saving work, and it really highlights the public health role that the medical examiner and coroner has, and the importance of that role. And I also have to acknowledge that none of the work that we're doing now would have happened but for Dr. Barbara Sampson and Dr. Ying Tang, who brought this lab into being here in this office. And so I just, with the support of our chief, longtime chief here, Dr. Hirsch, so I just wanted to, Charles Hirsch, so I just wanted to mention that and thank them for the foundation and for the past 20 years of really growth and development of this lab that's going to help us move into the next to the next level. I think, to more directly answer your question, I think you have to, this has to become part of the culture. It has to, in an office, it has to be normalized from leadership in terms of the expectations for medical examiners, for doctors who are performing autopsies, to put in their differential diagnoses, molecular genetic causes of death that would, you know, beyond the blood spot cards that we're all accustomed to keeping and have been doing, like Dr. Gill said, for decades, and holding on to those forever. The sample storage, the additional samples that are better than the blood spot cards, either a blood sample or a tissue sample in RNA later. I think that, you know, considering adding those when any genetic causes on the differential diagnosis is really important. Thankfully, the costs are falling and it's becoming more accessible to more offices. And so I think making the genetic causes, you know, ever present on the differential diagnosis, saving the appropriate samples, and discussing these cases, making sure that, you know, internally you have protocols that are going to ensure that you're not left without a diagnostic material at the end of a case. You know, identifying a lab, identifying a lab partner, a reference lab that you can partner with, and making sure that you are going to be able to meet their needs diagnostically based on your sampling procedures, which is very important. And you know, I think we're looking forward to, we're going to start trying to extend this testing to family members internally in our lab, because we're finding that a lot of those folks, although we recommend testing and our genetic counselor deals with them, they're just not getting the testing they need. And there are so many barriers to that care that have to be addressed. But making the molecular genetics a part of the diagnostic conversation internally and normalizing it amongst your medical staff, getting appropriate sampling, and then identifying a lab, I think, are really critical steps.
Absolutely. And you had mentioned the extra lavender top tube of blood, and specifically the mention of the RNA later. I thought that was important, as a lot of medical examiners are kind of standardized to formalin fix their tissue samples. And so just having that RNA later on hand can really promote greater genetic results and greater testing requirements. So thank you so much for sharing that. And another important kind of point you had mentioned is kind of the aspect of public health and medical examiners, coroners' offices' role in that, and that search for answers. So I didn't know if Dr. Sampson or Dr. Stram, if you'd kind of like to go into that a little bit more, as far as kind of finding the right answers, how that can affect the family, and kind of how you handle reporting those genetic results.
Certainly. Well, our job as medical examiners, if you have to sum it up in one sentence, is to determine the cause of death, and that result goes on the death certificate. The accuracy of the death certificate is paramount to every medical examiner for a number of reasons. Number one, of course, providing an answer to families, and in this case, impacting potentially surviving family members as well. But the accuracy of the death certificate is even more important than that. We mentioned just now public health. not only for the reasons we, already discussed, but if no one is testing for these diseases, then there's not going to be nobody funding research into these diseases. So that's another really important reason for, the most accurate death certificates that exist are those that come after an autopsy from the medical examiner's office. So if they're not doing that testing, it doesn't mean nobody's dying of these diseases. It just means we're not reporting them. So that's another really important aspect of what we do. And I also want to mention that this work that we do really informs research at a basic science level. Dr. Tang has established many great collaborations with academic centers across New York City and beyond, looking at the mutations that we identified. And that is yet another important aspect for furthering our understanding of these horrible diseases that kill often seemingly healthy babies and young adults. I also wanted to just add to what Dr. Graham, Gill, and Pineri were saying about funding. Funding, of course, of this testing by medical examiners is difficult. We were very lucky in New York City to have a very well-funded DNA lab already up and running 20 years ago, and we could add this on basically under the radar for a little while until we got important results, like the results that were described today. But once you have a few of these case studies to present to the politicians,
should be asked about this and give his or her permission. Predictive testing for adult onset conditions should be deferred unless an intervention initiated in childhood may
role of kind of the family impact, again, as we saw with Dr. Gounder and Dr. Liebman being here. I wondered if you guys had any more to add, kind of from the family's perspective of the role of the counselor. Your guys' background is obviously more genetic and medically focused, so you're a little bit more informed, but I didn't know if you'd like to provide any perspective.
I actually would like to say that listening to you made me feel a lot better. I spent 2 years tracking down family members, contacting them, and when I finally found 2 families that I think were very suspicious, they didn't want to hear from me. I felt really bad that I had failed them somehow. First I spoke with the widow and she promised to tell her son and daughter. I felt she really didn't. I was able to find the son. I spoke to him and he didn't really want to hear from me either. And nobody would ever let me know about the daughter. I don't know if she's still living or whatever happened, but I was unable to reach her. I did want to mention a couple of things that I had forgotten, if this is an okay time. One is that when there were a few other people who had the exact same mutation as in my family to the nucleotide, I corresponded with that set of authors, and it turned out that these 2 families were also Ashkenazi Jews, and that led me to look at the IBD internal. Anyway, it's an exome site at the time that was the most famous, and 1 in 800 Ashkenazis had that mutation, whereas no other ethnic groups had it. And so one of my questions was this new to my sister? My daughter has a mutation that's new to her. Well, no, this mutation had been around for many, many years, many, many generations. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that I got to know Dr. Tang and Dr. Sampson because I took out the autopsy report and I spoke with Dr. McNally. I said, well, shouldn't we find out if the decedent, had this mutation? And she said, well, if you can get the DNA. And I called Dr. Sampson and she remembered the case immediately and put me in touch with Dr. Tang, who provided the material necessary. And we were able to get it sequenced. Both Dr. McNally sequenced it, and then they sent it to GeneDx, and they sequenced it, and they never billed me. I don't know why, but
you're pointing out the fact that and you alluded to this when you spoke earlier, the fact that there may be decreased penetrance. In other words, not everybody who carries the variant will wind up manifesting the phenotype. And the other thing is that there may be variability in expression, so that, for instance, in Karen's case, she was pregnant. It may have been the stress of pregnancy that led to the her getting sicker and having this episode occur. So that may be running through the family, and a geneticist should be able to track, medical geneticists should be able to track that through the family. That was something that happened with our family, where the guy went down after exercising. We found in the lab that his sodium channel worked under normal conditions, but when he became acidotic, and there were a series of events that led to that, it wound up deforming the protein and leading to the channel no longer working. So it's those kinds of things that a geneticist can identify.
Yeah, even the 4-year-old who died, we were told later that it's unusual for a 4-year-old to die of an FLNC mutation. Maybe he had a virus in addition. So
Correct.
something else. It was a combination of things that caused the death. But meanwhile, we have this underlying mutation. And that's why I did not understand my niece's resistance to testing. She was too frightened. But to me, you may or may not die of this mutation. You don't know if you're going to die or not if you have it, and if you don't know if you have it, you may or may not die. So it's not that different. There's uncertainty whether you find out you have the mutation or whether you don't. The only thing you can be certain of, although I figured out I'm going to die anyway, is that if you don't have the mutation, you're not going to die of the mutation.
Right. But everybody's different and have different beliefs and that was something that occurred in the P family as well. The mother not wanting to test her kid because she thought that testing him would mean that he had it. She understood the implications, but it was not logical.
I'll just share a little bit from my own family's experience here as well. I think many families have, I think it's very common for there to be dysfunction in families where some people aren't talking to one another. And like many families, that was the case with my husband's family. And so that made it challenging to track down certain relatives and to talk them through this. I think that's the norm, not the exception. And then I think, sort of echoing what Susan and Bob were just saying, I think a lot of people, it's a combination of othering, where this happened to you, but you're not me, I'm not you, this couldn't happen to me. And it's a form of psychological protection, denial. I think that's also extremely common. And then this idea, and me as somebody who also sees patients still, this idea that the test gives you the disease, I think is also very common. And to just expect that those are going to be some of the areas of resistance you're going to face, and just be prepared. As somebody, again, who's a physician and work in a different space as an infectious disease doctor and epidemiologist, I also have areas where I have patients who are resistant to something like getting their COVID vaccine. And, this is something where it's not a one-time conversation. It's really showing that you're trustworthy, that you're curious, that you're invested in them. And over time, people come around if they feel that you really have their best interests at heart.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. We do have some questions filtering in, so we will go ahead and jump into those. So the first one is, what innovative approaches do you all envision for integrating advanced molecular autopsy techniques into more traditional forensic practices to enhance the accuracy and efficiency of cause of death determination?
I can take up this
Yes, go right
question.
ahead.
Actually quite extensively discussed in the 5 pre-recorded presentations. Um, Basically, if a medical examiner's office haven't had started doing molecular diagnostic work, I would, first thing I would say, save a variable sample. Like Manisha mentioned, some of the medical examiners' offices, they don't even have a blood stain card. And we, from our own work, we have uh, tested. We're really trying to use a formalin fixed sample, and then we actually realized the formalin fixed sample in the medical examiner's office is quite different from those in the clinical setting. When they do quick fixing, maybe just less than an hour, fixing a formalin, and then they quick look at the slides. So you see research paper talking about, oh, FFPE samples are good for molecular diagnostics. However, our own experience is um, the formalin fixed sample in medical examiner's office create not only gave poor uh, sequencing results, but also gave artifacts that due to fixation of a formalin, create cross link and then create nucleotide changes. And what happened is if you only have this formalin fixed sample for a case, and you identified a change in the, we call it a variant in the gene, you don't even have other sample, like you don't even know it's true what is the artifact. So therefore, making the molecular diagnostic inaccurate. So I think first thing is should be for a medical examiner's office to have a policy, whole agency, whole office level policy to save a variable sample for every single case. So I think that's a good start. And then we can talk about based on the phenotype, uh, is it a cardiac death? Is it epilepsy related death? Is it a autopsy? Is it thrombophilia? So we could do panel testing, or is it completely negative autopsy? There is, perhaps we have to do more expensive, like exome sequencing or whole genome sequencing to identify. So I felt like I don't know if it answers your question. So I highly encourage you to watch the recorded 5 presentations. So hopefully you'll find some answer there. And the quick answer is what I can provide it here. Thank you.
If I
Dr.
can-
Paneri, did you have something to add? Sorry.
I was just going to mention that in an ideal world, we would save samples and on everybody and for availability, but we are all restricted by constraints within our own buildings, our sample storage. These aren't the only samples we're saving, and so there is a little bit of a challenge there. But I think the way to get this more widespread is things like this, getting the word out. Because I learned something new today. I just placed an order for the RNA later, so so that we'll have that for our case now. So it's just getting the word out is really what it is, because the technology is there and it's only going to improve and get better over time. So the more we have available to test, the better it will be. But the sample storage is the number one.
And I would like to add, sorry, I would like to add, I think part of this educational event is trying to understand what are the challenges, what are the needs, gap of understanding. After I felt I personally learned so much from each one of you, and I felt after this event, if we could, probably there's a need for us to generate written documentation, including guideline for how to integrate molecular autopsy in standardized forensic investigation, and how to start with sample saving, how to identify laboratory could help them, and how to understand different type, complexity of the testing report, and a complexity of speaking to the family. Really needed, genetic professionals to be able to speak to guide family members. So I think probably that's the next step for us to generate such document will be beneficial to the medical legal investigator field in the field. Have a border, dissemination.
Absolutely. And we had one comment. It says, as a national patient advocacy organization for aortic dissection, unfortunately, many families come to us after the death of a loved one. Given the number of different jurisdictions, we see a huge variation in who is offered autopsy, what samples are saved, who pays, etc. So I think this goes into kind of creating those standards. And they kind of say what research could be done to demonstrate benefit and kind of create those standards around that. And so I was wondering if we could go into a little bit kind of, as she had mentioned, the variation of procedure, especially in some of these kind of heart-related conditions in older patients. Have any of you kind of found case clues that maybe indicate further genetic testing if there's no phenotypic results that you would recommend kind of pursuing this type of testing for? Go ahead,
I would, oh, sorry. So I would say that that really begins with the history, having a really excellent history that's provided by your medical legal investigator. That at the get-go really gives you a very strong idea of where a case is likely to be headed. So before the doctor even begins the examination, they are receiving a lot of information that will direct what they're most concerned about in a case. And so having a very structured interview that you're setting up with your investigators for the types of questions that the doctor needs the answers to in order to approach the case correctly is very helpful. And that can really also begin to help guide what cases will ultimately go on to testing.
Excellent. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Perry.
Yeah, so I think the key to that is getting the autopsy done, and the access to autopsy is not uniform across the U.S., unfortunately. If you're in a rural area and you're 45 years old and you die suddenly and the paramedics say it's a heart attack, you most likely won't be getting an autopsy. They don't have the funds to pay for that. And so it really just depends on where you live and what access you have to those services. And even if you do live in a busy office, most likely they're overrun with homicides and drug-related deaths too, so they may not do a full autopsy on individuals as well. So we're in a really critical workforce shortage right now for forensic pathologists, and there just aren't enough of us to do the work, despite how valuable it is. And so it's really kind of a battle that we're all struggling with. Some offices have reduced their level for autopsy to 50 years old for natural deaths. And as that number is come and gone for me, it kind of hits close to home that I don't have any medical problems. And if I dropped dead, I wouldn't necessarily get an autopsy in where I live. So in my jurisdiction, I would. So it really just kind of depends on where you live and what the resources are. And the answer to that is money, and we're not getting enough, and resources to do the work.
Dr. Graham.
Yeah, I certainly agree with all that she just said, Dr. Perry. But a lot of these cases, if they make it to the hospital, we would get the cases that die in the field, that die at home or on the street. But the cases that get to the hospital, that get a diagnosis of aortic dissection, for example, in the hospital and go on to die there, those may not even be reported to us altogether. And if they are, many of them likely jurisdiction would be declined just because there's a natural explanation for the death. But it goes back to something Dr. Gill mentioned earlier on, which is thinking toward proximate cause. The etiologically specific reason or the proximate cause certainly in a younger person, but really, across the spectrum of, from everything, the cardiac disease to epilepsy to pulmonary thromboemboli, the proximate genetic causes that may be at play that, you know, that testing can be done in the setting of a hospital autopsy. But, you know, the cases that come to us are, you know, having a low threshold of suspicion and thinking proximate cause-wise. Thanks.
And, Dr. Gill.
Yeah, as far as the research that can be done to demonstrate the benefits and so forth, you know, I mean, I think continuing to publish reports about these cases, and actually, you know, it'd be wonderful to do a retrospective look, to go back 20 years and pull out those deaths that we certified as cardiac arrest of undetermined etiology or mitral valve prolapse, and do the testing on those. I mean, we have those blood cards, and to be able to present that and say, look, we went back and looked at all these sudden deaths that didn't have and we found that 30% of them had a molecular explanation. And I think that would educate a lot of people and be a powerful research project.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gill. And Dr. Lehman. Oh, your mic's off.
Even when families are offered an autopsy, the general public thinks of an autopsy as something in case there was a poisoning, or, you know, they don't want to be associated with that. They don't realize that the autopsy could save their children's lives. And we need to educate people so that, I mean, it's sort of an unpleasant thing to think about your relative's body being touched. And especially because, after all, they're touching it to accuse you of killing them. But we need to understand that it can save lives.
And now that I work at a hospital with the autopsy service, the clinicians also need to be educated on the value of the autopsy so that they explain to the families, and the families give permission for autopsies in these kinds of cases. And that is not happening even in a big academic center with, you know, does a lot of autopsies.
Yeah, the physician who told us no, he was doing us a big favor by not pushing on the autopsy. And I didn't realize till years later.
Excellent. Well, we are at the top of the hour. If people can stick around, I didn't know if anyone would like to share their final thoughts or any kind of topics we haven't touched on before we close out for the day.